All right. Once again, in the name of the Father, the Son, Holy Spirit, amen. Almighty Father, thank you for this day as we celebrate the holy name of Jesus. We recall the perfect timing that you sent your Son into the world to save us all. Help us to learn more tonight about that timing so we can glorify you and evangelize your people. Yes, through Christ our Lord.
Amen.
Yeah, so tonight we're kind of going to talk about really, in some ways, liturgical time, but also really more discuss the reasons why the church chooses to celebrate days on certain days. And this kind of started with a question from our RCIA candidates, which, by the way, we have 13 people, which is really great, maybe even more by it's all said and done. And there was a question about Christmas, which I think was a fascinating question. I think a question a lot of people have, Catholic and non-Catholic. Why do we celebrate Christmas on December 25th? Now, there's a lot of going theories out there, and they're not necessarily wrong. Like, for instance, it was thought that the Feast of Christmas coincided with a lot of Roman pagan holidays, especially centered towards the winter solstice, right? And in some ways, theologically speaking, there's kind of a fitting, I don't know, attribute to say that God came into the world when it's most darkest in the world, right? You know, the winter solstice is the darkest day of the year, right? We have more darkness than we do light, sunlight in that day. And the fact that God would come in and become one of us in that time, there's kind of fittingness to that in some ways. That tended to coincide with a pagan holiday of Sol Invictus. Now, Sol Invictus actually came after Christianity, right? So we can't necessarily, it was based on that. You could say that the Romans were kind of celebrating that already, so maybe it was kind of fitting assimilation. There was another pagan holiday that was celebrated during that time called Saturnalia, but that was only celebrated, it was actually celebrated before the winter solstice from the 17th to the 23rd. So the 25th doesn't really fall within that line. So, I mean, it's close, but you could say based on the Julian calendar and the Gregorian calendar, was there coincide? Well, actually, no. Actually, been farther time away from that, but regardless, yeah.
And the Jews were following a lunar calendar.
Yeah, so the Jews follow the lunar calendar, which is why the feast of Passover is always based, it always changes, which is also why Easter changes. We'll talk about that a little bit too. But Christmas primarily, it was so it really you have to look at the death of Jesus to actually understand this. And we'll look a little bit about in some of these scriptures. So we look at the earliest kind of depiction of the timing is actually given to us by Luke in chapter 2. So Luke actually was the last synoptic gospel, right? So whether Matthew or Mark started, there's a big debate. Some think Matthew was the first gospel, I think Mark was the first gospel. Regardless, they were coming out around the 40s, about 10 years or so after Jesus died. Luke probably wrote his a little bit later, probably closer to the 50s, because he was also a follower of Paul, right? So his information was coming primarily through Paul, although it was thought that Luke did interview the apostles and even the Blessed Mother, which is where he got a lot of the Christmas story from. Actually, it's kind of beautifully depicted in The Chosen. If you guys ever watch that series, it's actually a very kind of interesting that you have Luke actually interviewing. I think it was John. No, Luke was interviewing the different apostles, and it was kind of like asking them questions about all the stuff because and Luke, being a physician and scientist, he wants to be very accurate, right? So it's good that he's trying to ask these questions. So the first indication we actually have is in those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus. Okay, so Caesar Augustus was the Roman emperor from about 37 BC till about 14 AD, right? So he had a long kind of rule, right? He was there for a long time. So far we're good, right? That's right in that time frame as far as that's going. And it also talks about Quirinius as the governor of Syria. Now, this was what causes some controversy about the timing, because Quirinius was actually the governor of Syria in about 6 AD. And so there was also talk about the consensus that was sold out. So, and that actually happened about 6 AD. And because of that, there actually was a revolt that caused a lot of problems within the Roman Empire when it came to Israel. But regardless, that is kind of the time frame that Luke kind of settles where this all kind of happened, right? So about that time, that's where John the Baptist was conceived, and shortly after that, Jesus, Mary, Joseph, and the infant Jesus in the womb traveled to Bethlehem to be enrolled where Jesus was born. Now, why the reason that's kind of controversial is because in the book of Matthew, if we go to Matthew's gospel, and I think it's right here, I think it's Matthew 1. Matthew chapter 2, verse 1. When Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, the days of King Herod. Now, this is what kind of causes some confusion, because Herod actually ruled from about, I think it was 20 BC, all the way to about 6 BC or AD, right? So, okay, well, that's kind of still within the time frame that Luke gives, but also we talk about the death of the Holy Innocents, which happens after this, right? That would have happened later than 6 because, well, he killed everyone 2 years and younger, right? So that kind of puts Jesus' birth around 480. Now, ultimately, that's not really necessarily important to know the year, because really we're talking about the date, right? Why December? And a lot of that centers around the actual discussion of the shepherds, right? So the shepherds were out at night, right? When they came, the angels come to them. Now, it's kind of thought, there's kind of 4 different theories on that too. Well, okay, if they're out in the fields, that means they're probably in warmer weather, maybe July, right? Maybe more like the spring. It also was thought that Jesus was going to be born during the time of the birthing of the lambs to be offered in the temple for Passover. So that kind of sheds some different understanding when we talk about December 25th, because, well, maybe it's closer, maybe it was a perfect circle and Jesus died right at the time of the same birth, right? So maybe the dates coincide in some way. But also too, there's theories that actually in Bethlehem there was actually special species of sheep that did give birth in the winter. The other argument against that too is if you've ever been to Bethlehem, which I have, in the winter it's not that cold. I mean, it's not, very rarely they get snow. It's relatively mild. Not that it gets like, I mean, it gets about the 40s, 30s, but at the worst. But it doesn't necessarily get to freezing. So that would also indicate that the shepherds, well, they could have been out there in the winter too, right? So that's not really a good indicator. What we actually get the date of Christmas actually comes from this theory that it's actually an ancient theory that any great man or great person, their death would actually coincide with the time of their conception. So when did Jesus die? Good Friday. Around that time frame, we calculated back to about the time of Jesus. And this is why the number kind of comes into play. There would have been a time around that time period where Good Friday fell on March 25th. So if the Annunciation happened March 25th, Jesus died on March 25th of the year 33 AD or around there. If you track that back 9 months, well, the birth then would be December 25th, right? In which case, that's where we look at the date. And then all these other subsequent dates, like, for instance, we celebrate to the naming, right? The name of Jesus, because coincide with circumcision, which means that February 2nd, also 40 days after Jesus opened the womb, be the Feast of the Presentation. Because that all corresponds to the Jewish rites of the circumcision and the consecration of any male or female that came out of the womb. So there actually is a good argument to say that December 25th actually is a good day. And it's not really based on pagan holidays or anything else. It's really just kind of coincides with this understanding that Jesus being a perfect being, his life would also be complete. In which case his conception and his death would actually fall the same day, March 25th. And therefore his birth would be December 25th. And all the holidays celebrated after that would kind of coincide. Any questions about that? Okay. And then, of course, Advent is kind of based on the Sundays before Christmas. So no matter what day Christmas falls on, we always have to have 4 Sundays. And that's how we kind of choose the Advent. But also, liturgically speaking, it's based on a 34-week ordinary time, which means that some weeks get swallowed up because of Easter and how that all falls into play, right? All right, so maybe let's talk about Easter then a little bit. We kind of already kind of broached that topic with Christmas. So how do we calculate Easter?
We don't.
Or how, well, you're right, the Pope does, technically, the
Well,
Pope has to
they-
do that right now.
Don't we go with Passover? Since
So the very-
Holy Thursday was Passover.
Well, the very first, I should say, the Last Supper coincided and his death coincided with Passover. That's very true. That just perfectly coincided that Thursday night that Jesus had his Last Supper with his disciples was the first night of Passover. Now there is some debate about, well, wait a minute, if that was the first night of Passover, and Jesus would have kind of died at the sacrificing of the lambs, which is the first thing that happens at Passover, wouldn't that have been on Thursday? Well, John kind of gives some clarity on this in his gospel, that actually what he says is the Sabbath of that week, because Passover is a whole week. The Sabbath during Passover is actually a very high holy day. And the lambs, in preparation for that Sabbath, the lambs was slaughtered on the Friday before the Sabbath, which is Saturday, right? And so his death would have coincided with the slaughtering of the lambs for the Passover celebration, at least for that particular Sabbath day. But Easter does not always coincide with Passover, because we understand a solar calendar. We have a solar calendar, and the Jewish people always had a lunar calendar. Now you can say, why don't we coincide with them? Well, the problem with that is it's hard to determine the date of the lunar calendar, because there's been kind of this break of that lineage to know when the first day of Nisan was and all these other days, because of the mix up with the solar calendar. In other words, the Jewish people adopted more of a solar calendar as time went on, and then the lunar calendar, even though it still dates Passover, it kind of got lost to history in some ways. But we do still calculate it based on the first Easter. And the first Easter, the Passover that year that Jesus died, was the first Sunday after the first full moon after the vernal equinox. Now that also is very controversial. Why is that controversial? Yeah. It's controversial because our Eastern Church brothers and sisters, in the Catholic Eastern churches and the Orthodox, they calculate Easter just based on the vernal equinox. So they don't worry about the moon. They just say the first Sunday after the vernal equinox, that's Easter Sunday, that's what we're going to celebrate. Okay, in reality, it doesn't make much of a difference, because actually, it just so happens that at the time of Jesus' death, they actually coincide on the same day. The first full moon after the vernal equinox was actually the first Sunday after the vernal equinox. So, all right, fine. If you want to celebrate that day, fine. But because the Jewish success was based on the lunar calendar, the Roman Catholic Church says, well, we should probably base on the lunar calendar too. That would coincide with the first new moon after the vernal equinox. So it's different every year, which is why Easter falls on a different Sunday every year, right? And that's been debated for centuries and centuries. But who has the ultimate responsibility to actually calculate that year, that time, that date?
Probably some Vatican office, I guess.
Yep. Which one?
Dicastery of.
Well, the actual practicality, that's true, but the Pope actually has that, right? I mean, he is the one responsible for it. So every Christmas, well, for most Christmases, and I think we're going to do it this year. I don't know if we've done this before this year, but on Epiphany, we're going to actually, I think, proclaim the movable feast of the year. And so, if you've ever been to Epiphany or a Christmas Mass, where after the homily or even during the homily, a deacon or even a priest would chant the movable feast. That's actually in the missal saying on the 22nd day of April. Like, so it's actually chanted when Easter will fall, when the Passion Sunday will fall, when Pentecost will fall, when all the other movable holidays throughout the year will actually fall, including the first Sunday of Advent, right? And that's all based on what the Pope calculates to be Easter Sunday. That's what we base the rest of the calendar is kind of based on. Right. But again, that's kind of controversial because, well, okay, we know that Jesus did die over Passover. But because Passover changes, the most accurate way, at least was seen by the Roman Catholic Church, is to calculate that based on the vernal equinox and the full moon after the vernal equinox. So whatever Sunday falls after that moment, that would be Easter Sunday. That makes sense. Okay. So most of that's kind of how we determine those things. So Easter, then of course, Marilyn brought up earlier. Well, Ascension, that's kind of another controversial date because, well, the Bible's pretty clear. That is the only actual date in the Bible, like day in the Bible we're actually given. That 40 days after the resurrection, that's when Jesus ascended to heaven, right? Well, 40 days after any Sunday is going to be a Thursday. Now, about 20 years ago or so, the bishops of North America got together and said, you know what, for pastoral reasons, in certain dioceses, depending, and it's up to the bishops, right? But the USCCB said, well, it's allowed for bishops to move that feast or that solemnity from Thursday to Sunday. Why on God's green earth do you think the bishops decided to do that?
So people would show up.
Precisely. So it was thought, pastorally speaking, to be less of a burden on the people of God to take away a holy day of obligation and make it a Sunday, right? And that's basically what they did. It says now they didn't say you should or you have to, because we still have certain areas, certain dioceses in the United States that don't.
What about other countries?
Yeah.
Yeah,
So the USCB is just governing the United States, right? So if you were to go to Rome, when do they celebrate the Ascension?
Thursday.
Thursday. Most of Europe does that. Africa, everywhere else in the world, pretty much does it on Thursday. United States, again, it wasn't said you should or shouldn't. It's just that you can. The bishops in their particular region can make that determination to be less of a burden on people, right? To say, well, you know, Father, I gotta work, you know, I gotta do this other stuff. This is a problem. Okay, let's try to make it less burdensome on you and take the burden of sin away. That was kind of the pastoral approach. Now, you could say, why would you do that with that day, not any other day? Because that's the only day we're given in the Bible. It actually says for sure that that's the day, right? It seems very biblical, and it seems difficult to change that, and maybe even wrong to change that. Well, first off, we have to understand the church has that authority, right? They can change days of celebration and move feast days and do whatever they want as far as that's concerned for good reason. And it's thought that pastoral application is a good reason, which if you read any documents, it's always riddled with you do this except for pastoral reasons. So if you ever really need liturgical documents, it's kind of amazing what they say, like, oh yeah, one should do this, this, and this, except for liturgical, for pastoral reasons.
Especially for Americans.
Right. Because Americans, we don't like a lot of rules, right? We don't like to be saddled with a lot of, you know, top-down applications. So it's a level of kind of freedom. Now, there are certain dioceses in the United States, like for instance, New York. New York celebrates the Ascension on Ascension. Now, it just so happens that the metropolitan for that area happens to be St. Louis. Maybe that's something to do with it. Nebraska, they celebrate on Thursday. And just happens the metropolitan up there is from St. Louis. I don't know that maybe the Rome of the West has something to do with that. I'm not really sure, but it's fascinating that here in St. Louis, we don't. We celebrate on Sunday.
Hence, they're gone.
Well, now there's always kind of hope sometimes when a new bishop comes because, well, for instance, Archbishop Rosansky, he's from the East Coast. He's from an area of Baltimore, which also does celebrate Ascension Thursday on Thursday. Could he change it? Certainly could. That's well within his boundary with his jurisdiction. If tomorrow wants to come and say, hey, by the way, we're going to celebrate Ascension Thursday on Thursday. Cool. Fine with me, right? Would you get some pushback on that? I don't know. Not from the priest, I don't think, but what can you do? And then, of course, 9 days after that is Pentecost, right? It's 50 days after the resurrection is always Pentecost, another Sunday. Okay. Then we have these other feasts that are added on, and this is kind of what eats up the ordinary time weeks, because depending on when Sunday falls, it could take place of, overlap some of the ordinary time Sundays. And also some of the other Sundays are sucked up, so to speak, by Corpus Christi and Trinity Sunday, right? So those are the Sundays, subsequent Sundays after Pentecost.
Divine Mercy.
Divine Mercy is only the second Sunday of Easter. So Easter, just like in Christmas, it's celebrated as an octave, right? So it's not, basically the thought there theologically is one day cannot contain the resurrection nor the birth of Jesus. So we celebrate 8 days, subsequent days after those first days, as if it were Christmas Day or Easter Sunday, right? Because basically, if you come to Mass on December 26th or the Monday after Easter, we celebrate the Sunday, or Christmas for 26th, or Easter, the Easter octave. Now, it's a little bit more solemn for Easter than it is for Christmas, because we have these other feast days, right? So we have Saint Stephen after Christmas. We have Saint John. We have the Holy Innocents. And these kind of coincide mostly, not necessarily the fact that it's kind of beautiful to have the birth of Jesus also followed by the first one to die for him. And then also the last apostle to die after that. And also these innocent first saints really they get into heaven, which are the Holy Innocents. There's a beauty in that. But also, that just so happened to coincide at their deaths, right? So typically when it comes to saints, particular saints, the Vatican determines the date that we celebrate those days based on certain factors. So for instance, John the 23rd, we celebrate his feast day on October 11th. Why? He didn't die on October 11th. He wasn't born October 11th. He wasn't elevated to the episcopacy or to the papacy on October 11th. What did happen October 11th of 1962?
Vatican
I'm
II.
sorry. Yeah, 62. That's right. Yeah.
Vatican II.
Vatican II opened. And because John the 23rd was the one, the Pope that started leading up and then convened Vatican II, we celebrate his feast day on that day. Most other saints we celebrate on their death days, right? Their heavenly birth days, right? So when they actually enter into heaven, whether it actually happens on the day or not, whatever, who knows? But that's typically that's how the Vatican determines what day we celebrate those feasts. Now, other days though, it's kind of more biblical as well. So we know, for instance, that John the Baptist was born 6 months before Jesus, right? So his birthday is June 24th, right? The visitation is kind of an interesting date because that kind of coincides with the month of Mary. Whether she actually visited Elizabeth on May 31st, probably not, because she would have been with her for quite a while. Probably at least 3 months, we're told in the Bible, before John was born. So it was probably closer to March or April. And if you look at it, it doesn't take that long to get from Nazareth down to the hills of Judea. Probably about 9 days. So if you think about it, the Annunciation happened March 25th. She probably would have been down there by early April at the latest, right? So why that? I think it's because it coincides with the month of May. And so that kind of a fitting end to that month that we celebrate the visitation. So there's always these reasons why the church kind of chooses these holidays, and a lot of them are based on calculations or have some biblical reference. Many of them are based on kind of the life of the particular saint that we celebrate. Some are very, very clear, right? Some are a little more obscure. So we have to be careful about that. Yeah.
Since you brought up Vatican II, extraordinary form, and then the calendar that they're following.
Right. Right,
and we don't need to go down the whole rabbit hole, but,
yeah,
well, why?
Yeah.
What's going on there?
yeah, that's a good question. Okay, so maybe it's first off a good question to start off with. The extraordinary form of the Mass, or they call the Trinity Mass, right? When did we actually start celebrating that as a church?
Like when Jesus died or right away?
No, actually, no, that's the thing about it. There are actually different forms of the Mass for the Trinity Mass. So for instance, we see the various rites of the Eastern churches develop because of this different way of celebrating. Now, they're all structured the same. If you were going to, let's say, a Byzantine or Maronite or Ukrainian Mass, right, you're always gonna have liturgy of the Word, you always have liturgy of the Eucharist. Now, things in between might be a little different, but for the most part, that's always what you're gonna have. You're always gonna have reading in the gospel. You're always gonna have profession of faith. You're always gonna have the consecration. You're always gonna have the distribution of Eucharist. That always happens at every Mass, what's it all together. But even within the Roman rite of the Catholic Church, there's been different rites, forms of that rite that have developed all throughout history. And to the point where it's thought that even our current Novus Ordo was actually harkening back to the original house masses and the masses that were celebrated in the catacombs. Maybe, I don't know enough of the history of that to say for sure, but that's actually what was kind of based on, that's kind of was going into Vatican II, the thought processes of how that was actually celebrated. Now, there also was some kind of innovations that happened too. Like for instance, nowhere you'll find the documents of Vatican II does it say that you take the altar away from the tabernacle. There's nothing saying you should do that, right? It just so happened that at the time going into the council and around then, the churches that were being built at that time were kind of starting to be designed that way, including our own, right? So okay, let's say you should do that or you shouldn't do it, but we're starting to do it now. Okay, well, great.
Well, didn't they change all of the churches? They changed St. James the Greater.
They no, sure. The ones that were already built that way, some they did, not all
Oh,
of them.
yeah. St. James.
Right. But what I'm saying, the buildings, most of the churches were built like in the 40s, 50s, 60s. Some of the more older churches, like for instance, like the old cathedral and Queen of Victories, even the cathedral itself, right? They did end up moving the altar away. What was fascinating about that is there's nothing that was written to say do that. There was nothing out of Vatican II that said now pull the altar away from the.
So would that have been Cardinal Ritter, I guess? The
At that
Cardinal?
time, that probably
Was it his decision?
but here's another thing you have to understand when we talk about canon law. Canon law, there is an attribute of canon law called MOS, M-O-S. And MOS, what that translated loosely is into tradition, right? So what that means is a particular church, like for instance, St. Gabriel. If we have a tradition that we've been doing here for at least 35 years, with the ordinary's knowledge, with the Archbishop's knowledge, that becomes canon law for this particular church. So let's say we have let's say, for instance, we have a processional route we do for Corpus Christi. We do that route every year, 35 years. We go we go all around the park, whatever it may be, who cares? The bishop knows about that. He says nothing about it, and all his successors say nothing about it. It then becomes particular law for us. And that's kind of what happened with a lot of these altars that, well, we started pulling away. The bishop didn't say anything about it for 35 years, now plus, and therefore it then becomes canon law for this particular church.
Because for St. James, I was in 5th grade in 62. So by the time everything came to be,
Right.
They took out the altar rail.
Yep.
But I wanted to ask you something. You said in, I think it might have been the formation class. Somebody asked you about Latin, why you like the Latin so much. And you said either because I love God or because I love the church.
Yeah. So St. Jerome, this is back in the 4th century, said love of Latin is love of the church.
Oh.
That's an ancient thing now, but also too, even the documents of Vatican II very clearly state in Sacrosanctum Concilium that Latin is the mother tongue of the church. And that
Okay, because
Latin-
Jesus didn't speak Latin, it was around then.
Yeah, well, he would have probably known Latin. But he would have spoken, his primary language was Aramaic.
Yeah.
And actually, the Chaldean Rite of the Catholic Church celebrates Mass in Aramaic.
Well, may I ask you, besides Saint Jerome, when did you develop a personal love for it? Before
No,
or
actually,
after
well,
you learned Latin?
when I started studying, but also primarily when I first went to my first extraordinary form Mass.
When, as a child?
No, I was seminarian when I first went to the
Oh,
extraordinary form Mass,
okay.
yeah. And there was a lot of mysticism and beauty, and when you start learning, like, what you start learning is that the words we use in Novus Ordo are all come from Latin.
Uh-huh.
There's
Yeah.
Latin, all those prayers are in Latin, they're being translated. And what you also realize a lot of times is translation betrays meaning. That there are certain words in English that can't be translated from Latin. And that causes some problems, right?
Well, the reason I ask is because when we were school children and, we went to mass and you had to read the mass
Mhm.
in the missal,
Mhm.
and there's no point in looking up because all you were looking at is somebody's back. They rang the bell. So you knew when they
Yeah,
lifted the hose.
right.
But I have my mom's prayer book. And it has a whole section on prayers appropriate to say during mass. Cause you don't know what's going on
Yeah,
the altar.
Yeah,
But as soon as you said that, I thought, I wonder if he knew Latin at that time because.
not at that time, no.
Yeah, okay,
Yeah.
because we didn't.
Yeah.
And. it
Well,
was-
I've said this before, I think what's happened since Vatican II is this kind of vicious circle of the spirit of Vatican II. So for instance, what the documents say is that the vernacular can be used so people know what's happening, right? So the Novus Ordo,
Mhm.
yeah, use the vernacular so people know what's going on, good.
Mhm.
But what also says in the very next sentence is, but Latin should be retained once people know what we're doing.
Mhm.
So what's kind of happened is we've gotten this first vicious circle where, okay, well, we stopped learning Latin. Well, why? Well, because we're not saying the Mass anymore. Why are we not saying the Mass anymore? Well, because we're not learning Latin, right?
Well, when I went to high school, we had a choice. We could take 2 years of Latin and 2 years of language or 4 years of language. I took 4 years of Spanish. Now, I can say 5 things,
Yeah.
none of them having to do. But, well, I wish I had because I happen to be a grammar nerd, but. And it would help me with Spanish, but, it didn't occur to me that that would be, something that I would use in the mass, because
Right.
I just read it.
Yeah,
Now, I appreciated the Latin mass you did a couple months ago, because I know it in English.
sure, right,
And, I'm kind of saying the prayers
yeah,
along,
yeah,
and that's very meaningful to me.
yeah.
I don't think I'd try to go every morning.
Right,
if I
right.
didn't know what was
Yeah.
going on.
But I think that's actually the point, is that, if you were to use it, I mean, the thing is, if you don't use it, you lose it, right? As
Uh-huh.
you experience. If we were using it in the Mass though, every Sunday, you'd retain it.
Yeah, but I would be retaining it phonetically. I don't know that I would know the words if I wasn't listening to them so often.
Well,
I don't know.
I think that's an interesting question. It could be chicken and the egg, I don't know, but
Yeah.
I think regardless, you could still kind of pick those up as you go along. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
we learn our own languages, our vernacular language in the same way. We phonetically hear it,
Mhm.
and then we apply the meaning to it and keep on learning that, right?
And the smaller prayers, the Kyrie,
Yeah, and I think,
simple enough.
and I hope and what I was hoping to kind of ring true when it came to the Rate Caeli Mass we had back in December, was that I think what people tend to realize is that it's not really a lot that the people have to say.
Yeah,
It's not really too much, and a lot of it repeats itself, right?
yeah.
So yeah, I think we always have to be very cognizant of what these traditions are in the church and why they do. But so go back to the original question. So unless you have another question on that.
Well, I was just gonna say, I find it horrifying, all the commotion that's going on, so many are calling Pope Francis a heretic.
Mm,
crazy stuff like that, and, well, I remember as a teenager,
Mhm.
there were people who were gonna leave the church, because
Yeah.
the nuns were, the
Yeah.
sisters were gonna wear short habits.
Yeah.
And all of that, I think, falls under the heading of good grief.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that also, like I said, falls under the understanding of what was actually, and at this, I think the whole idea here is actually what actually was said at Vatican II and what actually was received and heard.
Yeah,
And I think those are two different things. And what we've kind of seen so far is a lot of what's been received and heard, and not actually what's been said. So to that point, going back to Mike's question about, so even that when we talk about Pope Francis has every authority to do whatever he wants when it comes to the right. He is the head liturgist of the Catholic Church.
mhm,
If he says tomorrow we're just going to do Novus Ordo, that's it. Okay, great. Now, but I think that's where a lot of consternation comes from. Now, you could say, well, why? But regardless, I mean, I think the reason he gave in Custodius, I can't remember it now. Tradition Custodes, right? I think it's reasonable. Now, you could say, well, yeah, but is it really true? I mean, what he was justifying his stance on was that, well, it seems like people go the extraordinary form, have an understanding of a mentality that is the only form. You cannot. It's almost greater than the Novus Ordo, and that's not what Vatican II says. That's not what Pope Benedict says. That's or God rest his soul. They're equal and even, right? There's benefits to both.
mhm.
And I think where a lot of the consternation comes from is not the fact that he made a point, which is valid. It's that he was talking about abuses in the extraordinary form, but not so much about abuses in the Novus Ordo. Because I think many of us have probably been to masses where even the vernacular, the words aren't said correctly. The words aren't said what was actually written, or the actions aren't done the way it's supposed to be done.
Mm.
Now, that doesn't invalidate the mass, but it is an abuse, and it's actually rather illicit. I mean, we even talk about that in certain sacraments. Like I know there's certain brothers of mine who don't always say the form of absolution correctly. And that's a problem. Because if you don't say the form properly, you're not absolving anybody. That's an issue. We've seen that with baptisms recently, right?
Yeah,
We instead of I. Why is it a big deal? Because the church is not baptizing the person, Jesus is.
yeah.
That's very important. So words do have meaning. There's a reason why they are. Now, all that being said, we've had different rites that have happened all throughout the history of the church, right? Even up to what's happened to those over time is when they come to the evangelization project. So for instance, when Benedict, right, Benedict the Great, when he went out and started his monasteries, he was going out to these pagan areas, especially in Germany, right? And was saying, okay, well, how are we going to solve it the mass? So we're actually doing the same thing. What's the Pope doing? Hey, Gregory, what are you doing over here? Okay, you're celebrating this mass this way. Great, that's how I'm going to do it. All right, then we start having like things like the Dominicans and the Jesuits, right? And they go back and say, okay, Holy Father, how do you celebrate the mass? Okay, that's not the same way as Gregory was doing it, but all right, we're going to start taking this all over the world and start doing it that way, right? So the Tridentine Mass came from the Council of Trent, 1534. That was based on the Papal Mass. How was the Pope doing it? Well, if the Pope's doing it that way, we should probably do it that way too. And so for 500 years, we've been celebrating that same way, right? But even that was different than what came before it, what came before that, what came before that. So the Novus Ordo, in many ways, it's nothing new. The only real difference is that you'll see the Roman Rite for the first time, it actually was being used in the vernacular of the place you were instead of in Latin. That was something that never did change. Even through the early history of the church, the popes were still celebrating masses in Latin. But again, Vatican II, they said, look, so people understand what this new way we're doing things, it's good for them to know in their own language what they're doing. But Latin should be retained as much as possibly can. And so I think that we've kind of lost track inside of that sometimes.
But how about the calendars, you know?
So that point, the Trinity Mass came before the change of the calendars, right? So so basically the Julian calendar was kind of set to the calendars all the way up through basically Trent. I mean, a little bit before Trent. there was a shift in the, around the same time, because basically we understood they were miscalculating the time wrong. Right, which is why we have leap years, why we have these other things that have been added to the calendar. And that actually, Neil deGrasse Tyson said the Catholics actually did it really well. They actually took math into consideration, actually calculated properly from then on. But what happened then is that kind of changed, adjusted the calendar between the two types. So you have the Trinity Mass still celebrating the old calendar and still maintain that tradition, while everyone else is celebrating new calendar. So many saints subsequent after that would have been on the new calendar while the old calendar was still in place. So we also, a lot of these ancient feasts that have been celebrated, like let's say Benedict or Martin de Tours or these other people, the dates wouldn't necessarily line up perfectly. And so they coincide with the old calendar, not so much with the new one. Because the extraordinary form was taking the one prior to Trent, while the new one is not have the incorporated one.
But let's say the days like Easter and
Right.
Christmas.
Right, and so that's the other thing too, like if you look at the Tridentine Mass, what they do, instead of like ordinary time, they have the Sunday after Pentecost, and the second Sunday after Pentecost, so the third Sunday after Pentecost, based all the way up to Advent. Even the kind of change in color, so for a long time, these Sundays after Pentecost, the priests would wear red for a certain amount of time. Actually, it was funny, I think it was Paul VI, the first time the new mass was implemented, the Sunday after Pentecost, he got his red vestments on, and they're like, well, your holiness, you can't go out that way. Well, why not? Well, we're in green now, it's ordinary time, you need to change your vestment. And so even the Holy Father had to adjust a little bit to what was going on. And it was kind of funny because he's the one that promulgated it, right? So, yeah, but change is nothing really new when it comes to the Catholic Church liturgically. One of the main principles is Ecclesia Reformata, right? Reforming church. We are constantly reforming, or at least striving for that. And part of that is being open to new information and truth that comes about that's different from facts, but also maintaining the tradition that we have, right? So that's why the two calendars, that the Trinity Mass is so old that it kind of was even predated the calendar we use now. And so it still maintained that feature and didn't change. I mean, it's probably too hard to do that, going back that long. Which is why the new calendar we have based on for the Novus Ordo.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah. Now, Marilyn had a question about Christmas trees too. So we talked about earlier about like these kind of ways that the church is Christianized certain pagan traditions. And that, part of that was, we talked about Christmas, how that kind of came about. I think though, too, we have to be very aware of some of these traditions that we have. Like we talked about, I think over Advent, the Advent calendar, the Advent wreath, right? So how that kind of came about. And that was kind of, again, based on a pagan tradition of this kind of wheel of light that gave honor to Invictus Sol, right? The god of the sun, but also as a way to kind of show that Christ is our light throughout these dark days of winter. The Christmas tree actually is a very interesting one. Does anyone know what saint is attributed to the Christmas tree?
What saint?
Does anyone know what region of the world it comes from?
I'm always going to say Germany, but
It's Germany, yeah. O Tannenbaum, right? Yeah, I'm sure, right? So who was the first apostle to the Germans? Any Germans in here? Yeah.
I don't know.
Saint Boniface.
Oh, yeah.
So Boniface, as the legend goes, he went into Germany, and as he was evangelizing, he witnessed during this time of year, Yule, what they called it, there would be this kind of decoration of a tree, right? Put the lights up the tree again, this kind of worship of the sun that, as it's gone during winter, we want to maintain this light. And as it happens, he apparently got so frustrated with them worshiping this tree that he cut it down, brought it into his home, and locked the door so no one could get in. And then that became the symbol of Christ our light. Same kind of with the Advent wreath. And that was the first Christmas tree.
A stolen tree.
A stolen tree. For good reason. I mean, he gave it back to back.
Good, yeah.
Yeah,
Didn't that make it right?
Well, he gave it back to back. So, but I mean, that's the thing, I think it was just, you see this a lot too with like, for instance, the Celtic cross. You ever see the Celtic cross, is the cross with like the circle? Well, why, do you know why that circle was added to the Celtic cross?
I mean, Celtic or Irish people around here.
Half Irish too.
Well, yeah.
When St. Patrick went to Ireland, again, the Celtic people worship the sun. And so instead of worshiping the S-U-N, he incorporated that into the crucifix, so they'd worship the S-O-N. And so that's why the Celtic cross has a circle.
But were the words,
The same?
yeah.
Yeah, no. Like, so, you know, but it was,
So it would-
but you know, I understand too that Patrick was English by birth, right? So he would have known English. So, or at least, what do you go, I guess Roman or Saxon, whatever. He would have had at least that structure of language. So, but again, he was trying to incorporate this already practice and make it and Christianize it, so that people, now he made it very clear what was going on. St. Patrick is kind of a very interesting person too. I mean, even the Trinity, the shamrock is kind of an interesting symbol. Even though it's never actually been kind of upheld by the church or really denied by the church. There are some issues about the understanding of the Trinity, but also too, how can you really explain the Trinity in a way that actually is not heretical? So I mean, even the symbol of the shamrock. Well, if you take one of the leaves away, it's still a shamrock. You know, when God, you take one of the persons away, it's no longer God. So there's this partialism that they call it that kind of came from that, even though that is not an official heresy of the church. But again, I think we see these saints that go out and do the best they can where they are, and they try to Christianize things when they can and reject things when they can't. I mean, we see it also just as recently as the 1520s, where the Franciscans came to the New World and they witnessed this human sacrifice that was going on and said, we can't do this, right? This is not reconciled with our understanding of what God wants us to do. Certain things you can be incorporated, but that cannot. So we see it all throughout the history of the church. So great. Questions, comments, concerns, heresies? About this or in general, whatever you guys got.
So theoretically, things could change again. The Pope could say, well, we're gonna have Christmas in March.
Yeah, you know, and that's the thing about it. It also makes it so kind of interesting, but also kind of scary in some ways, right? So, what authority does the church have? Right? Well, if Jesus gave us the keys of the kingdom, the answer to that is full. And when that comes into play, now again, it hasn't happened, but could it happen, for instance, if the church wants to change the words of institution of the Eucharist? Yeah. If the church wants to say, instead of using unleavened wheat bread, we're going to use Oreo cookies. Does the church have the authority to do that? Yeah. Now, will they? Probably not. I mean, I think you have a very good reason to say that. But that's the authority the church has.
Well, speaking of heresies and words, I really liked, if it matters, Pope Francis's suggestion that in English, because it is correct everywhere else, instead of saying lead us not into temptation, I think it's abandon us not or into sin. Because that is the way it's said everywhere else in the world. They don't say lead as if God would lead us astray.
Right. And again, I think that comes down to translations, right? So I don't know, inducas into tentationem, right? So induce, do not induce us into temptation. Okay, well, yeah, does that mean abandon us? Well, really what it means is actually, what does induce mean? What is the meaning of that word?
Abandon was my word. I think his was, what kind of keep us from.
Yeah. And again, part of that comes down to, okay, well, is there a word in English or in Italian or in Spanish that really gets to the meaning what inducas means? I mean, we have the word induct. Okay, do not induct us into invitation. Well, that seems like a little more,
Or is it possible that maybe that particular Latin word is a little misleading?
well, that could be because Latin was translated from what?
Greek.
Greek. And so I'd have to look at the Greek word.
Jesus also did.
True, but the original writers of the Bible were all in Greek and Hebrew, for instance. Jesus didn't speak Hebrew, well, didn't speak Hebrew primarily, but the Old Testament was all written in Hebrew. So I think part of that is not so much what Jesus spoke. It really comes down to how it's being translated. So you're right, and that's one of the big what we call maxims of theology, that translation does betray meaning. So when you're translating from Hebrew into Greek, into Latin, into English or Spanish, whatever, well, do those words translate perfectly?
Yeah.
Consubstantialum. Yeah, great, okay, sure. Let's go with that.
Yeah.
I talk about this time when it talks to when I train couples, I walk with couples in their preparation for marriage. We actually pray with Ephesians chapter 5. And Ephesians 5, that actually is used in the Feast of the Holy Family, the Office of Regents, that comes up. And the big word there that everyone wants to focus on is wives be subordinate to your husbands. Now, the Greek word that's used there is not subordinata, it's actually hypostasia. Now, hypostasia is actually a theological term. It means literally to stand under. Hypostasia, right? Hypodermic evil, But it also is used in the theological term of the hypostatic union, which is the definition of Jesus' incarnation, the two natures becoming one person. And in the hypostatic union, one nature supports the other. Which one do we think supports the what? The divine supports the human. So when Paul says hypostasia, what he's saying is, wives, you're like the divine nature of Jesus Christ in supporting your husband in his human nature. When you think about it that way, that puts a whole new meaning on it, right? And like I said, but unfortunately, people don't know the Greek. So they think that Paul just is a misogynist who wants wives just be completely blindly obedient to their husbands. So that's not what Paul
So
says.
that way you glide on through that particular teaching.
That's right. That's right. And I think it's also kind of very cowardly if preachers do not preach on that. Because you should. It gives a new understanding of what that actually is being said. So yeah, it's that happens all the time. Right.
Mhm.
And so yeah, it's now, can it be changed? Sure. But you also don't want to necessarily lose the meaning of what Jesus is saying too. What's your point? Right. And so I think it's important to look at that and say, what did Jesus actually say? What was being translated? What was being translated by the writers of the Bible? That's a good question.
And maybe abandon wouldn't be a great word either, because we understand he does not abandon.
Who does? Yeah, right.
But that wasn't exactly what it was supposed to be.
Yeah.
I just can't remember.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's yeah, like I said, these words are used and translated. We can question, like, well, I mean, and part of that too is like, well, St. Jerome is a saint, and he was he was smarter than I was when it comes to language. So obviously, I think he would have a better understanding than I about what word to use in that particular respect. People like Thomas Aquinas, I would assume that they would know better than I which term would work better in those things. And the fact they're saints kind of indicates, well, they probably give them some gift to do that. Well, very good. So tomorrow we have the first natural born saint from the United States, Elizabeth Antietam. So we celebrate her death day tomorrow. So it'll be good to hear that mass. Then we have Henry Nouwen on Newman on Thursday, so. With C23 in town, that's kind of fitting for them to have that. Well, very good. All right, any questions other than that? We'll wrap it up. Have a good night. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good to hear.
Right.
Now it's gonna be cold out.
Think so.
Is it?
It's getting a little